The galaxy did not remember the guards who ran. It remembered the one human who stayed. The emergency siren screamed through the upper towers of the ethery royal palace as silver-white smoke curled across the marble floor in slow waves. Red warning lights flashed against towering crystal pillars, bathing the massive chamber in pulses of crimson that made the polished walls look wet with blood even though none was there. Above the city, hundreds of transport lanes had already gone dark. Civilian broadcasts cut in and out between static bursts while distant explosions rolled across the skyline like thunder trapped beneath glass. Ethan Cole tightened his grip on the pulse rifle hanging against his armored chest as another shockwave rattled the palace windows. His tactical visor flickered twice before stabilizing. "Central Command is gone." A frightened voice crackled through the comm channel. "Repeat, all royal personnel evacuate immediately." Ethan looked up from the glowing wrist display toward the massive ceremonial doors at the far end of the corridor. Moments earlier, dozens of royal guards had stood there in perfect formation beneath the golden banners of House Vale. Now the hallway was empty except for discarded weapons, shattered helmets, and the echo of retreating footsteps somewhere deeper inside the palace. They had run. Every last one of them. Another alarm sounded overhead. Breach detected. Eastern wing compromised. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. The recycled air smelled like hot circuitry and scorched metal. Somewhere nearby, a power relay burst with a sharp pop, showering sparks across the ceiling. He should leave. Every instinct drilled into him during 12 years as a Marine screamed at him to reach extraction before the entire district collapsed into chaos. This was not his war, not his empire, not his queen. A sudden movement caught his eye. At the end of the corridor, partially hidden beside a cracked pillar, stood Queen Lysera Vale herself. For a brief second, Ethan almost didn't recognize her without the royal procession surrounding her. She stood alone beneath the flashing emergency lights, her long silver hair loose around her shoulders, the dark blue fabric of her ceremonial gown streaked with ash. Her glowing golden eyes scanned the empty corridor with something Ethan never expected to see on the face of the most powerful ruler in the quadrant. Shock, not fear. Something worse. Betrayal. The queen slowly looked toward the abandoned guard positions, then toward Ethan. "You are still here," she said quietly, her voice nearly drowned beneath the alarms. Ethan adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder. "Looks that way." Another tremor shook the palace. Pieces of white stone rained from the ceiling and shattered across the floor between them. Somewhere below, civilians screamed. Lysera straightened immediately, forcing the emotion from her face like a queen rebuilding a throne from ashes. "Then leave," she ordered. "The palace has fallen." Ethan glanced past her toward the darkened hallway leading deeper into the royal quarters. "What about you?" Her expression hardened. "My guards made their choice." The words landed heavier than the explosions outside. Ethan had seen combat before. He had watched soldiers panic, freeze, even break under pressure. But something about the silence in that hallway felt colder than any battlefield. The people sworn to protect her had abandoned her before the enemy even reached the throne room. Through the fractured palace windows, distant streams of ships crossed the night sky above the capital city. Fires burned across entire districts now, casting orange light against the low storm clouds. The whole planet was watching its empire collapse in real time. Ethan lowered his rifle slightly. "Ma'am," he said carefully. "Do you have an evacuation route?" Lysera stared at him in disbelief, almost suspicious of the question itself. "Why would that concern you, human?" Before Ethan could answer, the palace lights suddenly failed. Darkness swallowed the corridor. For one long second, the only sound was the mechanical groan of the dying building around them. Then emergency backup lights flickered on in dim red pulses. Ethan turned toward the shattered entrance behind him as distant footsteps echoed somewhere inside the palace. Slow, organized, getting closer. Lysera heard them too. Her face remained calm, but her hand tightened slightly against the side of the cracked pillar beside her. Ethan looked toward the exit corridor leading to the evacuation hangars, then back toward the queen standing alone beneath the red emergency lights. Finally, he sighed and checked the charge counter on his rifle. 38% remaining. "Well," he muttered softly, stepping between the approaching footsteps and the queen. "Guess somebody should stay." The footsteps grew louder through the dark corridor beneath the screaming alarms overhead. Ethan Cole moved forward slowly, boots scraping against broken marble as he positioned himself between Queen Lysera and the shattered entrance to the eastern wing. The dim emergency lights painted everything in deep red pulses that flashed across the black plating of his combat armor. His tactical visor tracked 3 separate heat signatures approaching from the lower hall. Professional movement. Tight formation. Not panicked civilians. Royal assassins? Ethan asked quietly without taking his eyes off the corridor ahead. Lysera stood behind him in complete silence for a moment before answering. Not anymore. Her voice carried a strange calmness now, colder than before. They belonged to my guard division this morning. Ethan tightened his jaw. So the rumors were true. This was not some random attack. The Empire was tearing itself apart from the inside. Another tremor rolled through the palace structure. Fine cracks spread across the crystal ceiling overhead, while distant emergency sirens echoed through the enormous royal district outside. Somewhere far below, anti-air batteries fired into the storm-dark sky above the capital. Ethan glanced sideways toward the queen. Even in the failing light, she still carried herself with impossible composure. Tall, elegant, untouchable. But now he noticed the details the galaxy never saw during speeches and ceremonies. The slight tremble in her breathing. The ash dust staining the edge of her sleeve. The exhaustion hidden beneath those glowing gold eyes. She had not expected betrayal tonight. There is still time for you to escape, Lysera said quietly. The southern hangars remain operational for another 7 minutes. Ethan gave a dry laugh under his breath. You timed that already? Queens survive by counting seconds. The approaching footsteps stopped suddenly beyond the corridor bend ahead. Silence settled across the hall. Heavy. Waiting. Ethan slowly raised his rifle toward the darkness. They know we are here. Lysera stepped closer behind him. You should not die for a collapsing empire, Ethan Cole. Hearing his full name in her voice caught him off guard for a second. He had not realized she remembered it. Good thing I am not fighting for the empire, he muttered. A metallic clang echoed nearby. Ethan reacted instantly, grabbing Lysera's arm and pulling her backward just as a section of ceiling crashed into the hallway in a shower of sparks and crystal dust. Smoke rolled across the floor, thick and bitter. The queen stumbled once before regaining her balance immediately. Ethan released her arm at once. Sorry. Lysera looked at him strangely. Not offended. Almost confused by the apology itself. Human soldiers apologize to their rulers? Ethan checked the collapsing hallway ahead. Only when we yank them into falling debris. For the first time since he met her, something shifted slightly in the queen's expression. Not amusement exactly. Something smaller. More human. Then another voice echoed through the corridor ahead. Calm. Amplified through palace speakers. Your Majesty, the unknown speaker announced. Your resistance is no longer required. Ethan immediately recognized the tactic. Psychological pressure. Make surrender sound civilized. The fleet has already pledged itself to Regent Malrek, the voice continued. The palace is surrounded. Your guards have abandoned you. Please do not force unnecessary suffering upon your citizens. Lysera's face became perfectly unreadable again, but Ethan noticed her fingers tighten subtly against the fabric near her wrist. Malrek, Ethan repeated quietly. Your military advisor? Former advisor, Lysera corrected. I should have executed him months ago. Ethan slowly crouched beside a damaged control panel near the wall. The display flickered weakly beneath. Layers of static interference. Palace schematics appeared for half a second before cutting out again. Tell me there is another way out. There is, Lysera answered. But it requires crossing the lower ceremonial bridge. Ethan looked up immediately. Wide open space. 500 feet above the central district. He stared at her for 2 long seconds. That sounds terrible. It was not designed for survival. Another explosion thundered somewhere outside the palace walls. Dust drifted from the ceiling like gray snow. Ethan rose slowly to his feet and adjusted the rifle against his shoulder. The charge counter now read 32%. Not enough. Not even close. But he stepped toward the smoke-filled corridor anyway. Behind him, Queen Lysera watched in silence as the human soldier moved toward danger, while every sworn protector of her empire had already disappeared into the night. The lower ceremonial bridge stretched through the center of the palace like a blade made of glass and silver light. Hundreds of feet below, the capital city burned beneath layers of storm clouds while emergency aircraft streaked across the skyline in glowing lines of blue and orange. Ethan Cole stepped cautiously onto the transparent bridge surface. his boots thudding softly against the reinforced crystal beneath him. The structure vibrated faintly with every distant explosion outside the palace walls. Queen Lysera followed several feet behind him, silent except for the faint rustle of dark ceremonial fabric brushing against the floor. The bridge had once been built for coronations and diplomatic processions. Now it looked like the last surviving road through a dying empire. Ethan checked the rifle charge again. 28%. His visor displayed multiple interference warnings across the lower corner of his vision. Internal palace systems were failing fast. Air circulation had already shut down in half the district. The temperature inside the bridge corridor was dropping by the minute. How much farther? He asked quietly. 300 yards, Lysera answered. Beyond the central chamber, there is an emergency descent lift. Ethan nodded once. And let me guess. Everybody knows about it. Only the Royal Council. He looked sideways at her. That sounds like a yes. Before she could answer, every light along the bridge suddenly flickered. A low mechanical hum echoed beneath the floor. Then steel barricades slammed down behind them with enough force to shake the entire structure. Ethan spun instantly, rifle raised toward the far end of the bridge. Dark figures emerged slowly through the red emergency haze ahead. For armored soldiers. Royal Guard insignias still visible across their chest plates. Ethan noticed Lysera stop walking behind him. The silence that followed felt heavier than the alarms. One of the guards removed his helmet slowly. Commander Darvek. Ethan recognized him from palace security briefings earlier that month. Decorated officer. Queen's Inner Circle. Your Majesty, Darvek said calmly, though his voice carried none of the respect his title implied. Please surrender peacefully. Lysera stood motionless beneath the pulsing red lights. You stood beside my throne for 11 years. Darvek lowered his eyes briefly. The Empire is changing. No, she answered softly. Only its cowards. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, placing himself fully between the guards and the Queen. His pulse rifle hummed quietly in the darkness. Darvek finally noticed him. Human, he said flatly. This does not concern you. Ethan glanced over the 4 armed soldiers blocking the bridge ahead. Feels like it concerns me now. One of the guards took a small step forward. Ethan immediately adjusted his aim. The movement stopped. Nobody wanted to be the first one to test whether the human soldier was bluffing. Outside the crystal walls surrounding the bridge, lightning flashed through the storm clouds above the city, illuminating the massive towers of the capital in pale blue light. Smoke drifted upward from entire districts already under rebel control. Ethan could see transport ships fleeing atmosphere in long glowing trails. People were abandoning the planet. The Empire truly was collapsing. You cannot protect her forever, Darvek warned. Ethan gave a tired smile beneath his visor. Forever is not really my specialty. The commander's expression hardened. Stand aside. Ethan slowly reached toward the emergency barricade controls mounted beside the bridge railing. I have a better idea. Before the guards reacted, he slammed his armored fist against the panel. Instantly, sections of the bridge erupted with blinding emergency smoke barriers, while warning sirens screamed through the chamber. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Move, Ethan barked. Lysera did not hesitate this time. Together they ran through the smoke-filled bridge while alarms thundered overhead and red warning lights flashed across the crystal walls around them. Ethan could hear the guards shouting somewhere behind the haze, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of collapsing systems throughout the palace. They reached the far side of the bridge seconds before another shockwave rolled through the capital. The floor lurched violently beneath them. Ethan grabbed the railing instinctively while Lysera steadied herself against the wall beside the sealed descent lift. Her silver hair had partially fallen loose again around her face, glowing faintly beneath the emergency lights. For a second, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there breathing hard while the Empire collapsed around them. Then Lysera looked directly at him with an expression Ethan could not quite read anymore. You lied to them, she said quietly. Ethan frowned. About what? You said forever was not your specialty. Another explosion echoed through the palace below them. The Queen's glowing golden eyes never left his face. But humans, she whispered softly, do not seem to understand how impossible loyalty looks to the rest of us. The emergency descent lift groaned as it carried them deep beneath the palace foundations. Old machinery rattled behind the steel walls while dim amber lights flickered overhead in uneven pulses. Ethan Cole leaned against the side railing, breathing slower now as the adrenaline began draining from his muscles. Sweat cooled beneath the collar of his combat armor. His right shoulder ached from where debris had clipped him on the ceremonial bridge, though he ignored it the way soldiers usually did. Across from him, Queen Lysera stood perfectly still despite the violent shaking of the lift platform beneath their feet. Her silver hair reflected the weak amber lights in soft waves, almost glowing against the darkness surrounding them. Neither spoke for nearly a full minute. Only the sound of grinding gears and distant explosions far above accompanied the long descent underground. Ethan finally broke the silence first. "So how far down does this place go?" Lysera kept her eyes forward. "The lower sanctum was built before your species discovered electricity." Ethan let out a quiet breath. "That deep, huh?" The first rulers of Ethar feared assassination from the stars. Her expression darkened slightly. It seems they were correct. The lift shuddered violently before slowing to a stop. Thick metal doors slid open with a long mechanical hiss, revealing a massive underground corridor stretching into darkness. Ancient stone walls curved overhead like the inside of a cathedral buried beneath the planet. Rows of dim blue lights ran along the floor edges, still functioning after centuries underground. Cold air drifted through the chamber carrying the faint smell of dust, metal, and old rain trapped somewhere deep in the foundations. Ethan stepped out first, rifle raised automatically as his visor scanned the corridor ahead. No movement, no heat signatures, just silence. Real silence this time. Not the frightened silence of collapsing systems or evacuating crowds. This place felt untouched by the chaos above. Lysera walked past him slowly, her hand brushing lightly across one of the ancient stone pillars as though greeting an old memory. "Very few living people know this sanctuary exists," she said softly. Ethan studied the massive chamber around them. "Please tell me there is food down here." To his surprise, the queen almost smiled. "Human priorities continue to fascinate me." Ethan shrugged tiredly. "Empires collapse. Stomachs stay consistent." The faint smile disappeared almost immediately, but something warmer remained behind her eyes now. Less distance, less royalty. They continued deeper into the underground sanctum together. The corridor eventually opened into a circular chamber filled with ancient control consoles and faded holographic projectors built into black stone walls. A low-energy hum still vibrated through the floor beneath their feet. Emergency systems. Backup power. Somehow still alive after all these centuries. Ethan slowly removed his cracked combat helmet for the first time that night. Cool underground air hit his face instantly. He ran one hand through sweat-damp brown hair before setting the damaged helmet on a nearby console. Lysera watched him carefully. "You trust this place enough to lower your guard?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Honestly, my neck was starting to feel like concrete." For a moment, she simply stared at him. Then something unexpected happened. The queen laughed softly. It was quiet, brief, almost disbelieving, but it was real. Ethan looked up in surprise. "What?" Lysera shook her head once. "The palace burns above us. Half the empire has betrayed me. And somehow you continue speaking to me like I am simply another exhausted soldier." Ethan leaned against the old console beside him. "Maybe because tonight you are." The words settled into the chamber between them. Not disrespectful. Not mocking. Honest. Lysera looked away first. Her glowing golden eyes drifted upward toward the stone ceiling far above them, where faint vibrations still echoed from the war consuming the capital overhead. "When I was crowned," she said quietly, "they told me a queen must never appear alone." Ethan followed her gaze toward the ceiling. Looks like they were wrong. Silence returned after that, but this time it no longer felt cold. Somewhere in the ancient chamber, old systems continued humming softly while the underground lights painted silver reflections across the queen's tired face. Ethan noticed then that she had stopped standing like a ruler surrounded by ceremony. Now she simply looked like someone carrying too much weight for too many years. And for the first time since the night began, Queen Lysera Vale no longer seemed surprised that the human soldier was still there beside her. Hours passed beneath the palace while the war above continued to shake dust from the ancient stone ceiling. The underground sanctum remained dim and cold, lit only by fading blue floor lights and the occasional flicker from damaged control panels along the curved walls. Ethan Cole sat on the edge of a broken console near the center chamber, carefully removing one armored glove to inspect the swelling in his shoulder. The bruise had darkened beneath the fabric of his combat suit, where falling debris struck him earlier on the bridge. Nothing broken. Probably. He rolled the shoulder once and immediately regretted it. "You are injured," Lysera said from across the chamber. Ethan glanced up. The queen stood near one of the ancient holographic pillars, studying fragments of military transmissions still stuttering through the damaged systems. Her silver hair reflected pale blue light as streams of unreadable symbols drifted across her face. "I have had worse," Ethan replied. Lysera looked toward him slowly. "That answer usually means the injury is significant." Ethan smiled faintly. "You sound like every field medic I ever ignored." The queen stepped away from the holographic display and crossed the chamber in calm silence. Even underground, stripped of her court and throne, she still carried an unnatural kind of grace. Not arrogance. Discipline. The kind shaped by years of people watching every movement she made. She stopped beside him and studied the damaged armor around his shoulder. "Remove the upper plate." Ethan blinked once. "You know how combat armor works? I know how soldiers hide pain." Her voice softened slightly. "Remove it." Ethan hesitated only a second before unlocking the shoulder plating. The black armor hissed quietly as magnetic seals released. Underneath, the dark fabric near his shoulder had partially torn from impact. Purple bruising spread across the skin beneath it. Lysera knelt beside him without ceremony. Ethan stiffened instinctively. Queens did not kneel. Not for anyone. But she ignored his surprise completely as she opened a small emergency medical case hidden inside the old console compartment beside them. "Your palace has emergency kits from 1,000 years ago," Ethan asked carefully. "E3 engineering values paranoia." She pressed a glowing medical strip gently against the bruised area. Cool relief spread through Ethan's shoulder almost immediately. He exhaled slowly through his teeth. "Okay," he admitted quietly. "That is impressive." Lysera continued working in silence for a few moments. The chamber remained peaceful except for the distant hum of ancient machinery beneath the floor. Then the damaged holographic system crackled sharply behind them. A transmission burst suddenly filled the chamber walls. "This is Regent Malrek addressing all surviving sectors of the Imperial fleet." Ethan and Lysera both turned instantly toward the flickering display. Malrek's image appeared distorted through static interference, but his voice came through perfectly clear. "Calm. Controlled. Victorious. The former queen has abandoned the capital," he announced. "All remaining military divisions are hereby ordered to stand down. Resistance only prolongs civilian suffering." Ethan watched Lysera carefully. Her face remained still. Too still. Malrek continued speaking. "The High Council has already recognized transitional authority. The Empire requires stability, not sentiment." Behind the rebel leader stood rows of fleet officers and royal advisors. Ethan recognized several of them immediately from palace briefings. Generals, ministers, people who once swore loyalty to the throne. "He already has the council," Ethan muttered quietly. Lysera said nothing. The hologram flickered again before dissolving into static. Silence returned to the underground chamber. Heavy this time. Ethan slowly looked back toward her. "How long?" Lysera remained kneeling beside him, one hand still resting lightly near the damaged armor plate. "What? How long have they been planning this?" For several seconds, she did not answer. Then finally, very softly, she spoke. "Long enough that nobody warned me." Ethan looked away toward the dark chamber walls. That sentence hurt more than the explosions above ever could. Not because she lost power, because she lost trust. Lysera lowered her gaze briefly to the floor beneath them. "When I was young," she said quietly, "my father once told me that rulers are never truly loved, only needed." Her golden eyes drifted toward the fading hologram systems. "Tonight, I discovered something worse." Ethan frowned slightly. "What is worse than that?" The queen's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Being no longer needed at all." Ethan studied her for a long moment beneath the cold underground lights. Then, without thinking much about it, he reached over and handed her the small metal canteen sitting beside him. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "I stayed." Lysera stared at the canteen in silence before finally accepting it with both hands. Somewhere far above them, another distant shockwave rolled through the buried stone ceiling. But neither of them moved. The underground sanctuary had no windows, yet Ethan Cole could still feel the storm raging above the planet. Every few minutes, faint vibrations rolled through the ancient stone walls like distant thunder buried beneath miles of earth. The old systems around them continued humming softly in the darkness, steady and indifferent, while an empire fought for survival overhead. Ethan sat near the circular control platform with his combat jacket partially unsealed, trying unsuccessfully to ignore the growing heat spreading through his bruised shoulder. The emergency medical strip Lysera applied earlier had dulled the pain, but exhaustion was beginning to settle into his bones now that the adrenaline had faded. His tactical visor rested beside him on the floor, its cracked display blinking weakly every few seconds. Across the chamber, Lysera stood before one of the inactive holographic pillars with both hands resting lightly against the cold black stone. She looked smaller somehow in the dim underground lighting. Not physically smaller, less untouchable. The silence between them no longer felt awkward now, just tired. "You should sleep," she said quietly without turning around. Ethan leaned his head back against the console behind him. "That sounds dangerous. You believe I would harm you?" There was no offense in her voice, only curiosity. Ethan let out a faint breath through his nose. "Honestly, I think if you wanted me dead, I would already be dead." That finally made her glance back toward him. A surprisingly rational answer. "I have those occasionally." Lysera slowly walked back toward the center chamber. The blue underground lights reflected softly across the silver strands of her hair as she stopped beside him again. Ethan noticed she no longer maintained the careful royal distance she held earlier that night. Somewhere between the collapsing palace and the underground silence, the invisible wall around her had started cracking. "You should still rest," she repeated more softly this time. Ethan rubbed one tired hand across his face. "I have not slept during active combat zones since Mars Colony." "You fought on Mars?" "Security deployment." He shrugged slightly. "Long time ago." Lysera studied him carefully for a moment. "You speak about war the way others speak about weather." Ethan stared toward the chamber floor. "That is usually how you survive it." The Queen lowered herself slowly onto the stone platform beside him. Not across from him. Beside him. Ethan noticed the movement immediately, but said nothing. For a while neither of them spoke. The ancient systems hummed quietly around them while dust drifted lazily through beams of dim blue light overhead. Finally Lysera broke the silence. "When I was a child," she said quietly, "I once asked my mother why rulers wear ceremonial crowns." Ethan glanced sideways toward her. "What did she say?" Lysera's glowing eyes remained fixed somewhere far away now. "She told me crowns exist, so the galaxy can always identify who must stand alone." Ethan frowned slightly at that. "That sounds miserable." A faint smile touched the corner of her lips. It was meant to sound noble. Ethan shook his head once. Humans usually just give speeches and cheap medals. This time her smile lingered a little longer. Then suddenly Ethan's visor crackled sharply from the floor beside them. Both of them reacted instantly. Ethan grabbed the damaged device and activated the audio feed. Static flooded the chamber for several seconds before a faint voice finally broke through. "Unidentified survivor channels. Respond immediately." Ethan straightened. "Human frequency. Military encrypted." "This is Cole," he answered quickly. "Identify yourself." More static. Then another voice came through, weak and distorted. "Cole, this is Lieutenant Harper. Resistance cells still active in Lower Capital District." Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Lysera. "Harper, where are you?" "Underground transit sectors. Listening posts confirm Malrek preparing fleet declaration at dawn." The signal crackled violently. If the Queen is alive, she must reach the orbital relay before sunrise. Then silence. Complete silence. Ethan stared down at the dead visor for several seconds before slowly lowering it. Across from him, Lysera's expression had become unreadable again. Calm on the surface, but her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the stone platform. "Orbital relay," Ethan muttered quietly. "That is where he plans to legitimize control." Lysera nodded once. "Every world in the Empire will witness it live." Ethan looked toward the dark tunnel entrances surrounding the sanctuary chamber. "Then I guess hiding underground is officially over." For a long moment the Queen said nothing. Then very quietly, almost too quietly to hear, she spoke. "You still have time to leave before this becomes hopeless." Ethan looked directly at her. Tired, bruised, exhausted beyond reason, but still there. "Lysera," he said softly for the first time without using her title. "I think we crossed hopeless a while ago." The Queen froze slightly at the sound of her name in his voice. Not disrespectful, not formal, just human. Somewhere deep beneath the dying palace, surrounded by ancient stone and fading blue lights, Queen Lysera realized she no longer felt alone in the dark. The transit tunnels beneath the capital smelled like cold metal, rainwater, and burned circuitry. Ethan Cole moved carefully through the darkness with his pulse rifle raised while dim maintenance lights flickered overhead in weak blue intervals. Beside him, Lysera kept pace beneath the hooded cloak they found inside the sanctuary armory, though nothing could fully hide the quiet authority in the way she carried herself. Somewhere above them, the city continued dying one district at a time. Every few minutes the tunnel walls trembled faintly from distant impacts shaking the surface streets overhead. Ethan checked the cracked display on his tactical visor again. Still unstable, but functional enough to map nearby motion. "How much farther to the relay access elevators?" he asked quietly. "Less than 1 mile," Lysera answered. "The orbital tower connects directly to the old transit grid." Ethan nodded once. "Then Malrek probably has every route covered already." Yes. Her honesty would have been depressing if Ethan had not already accepted the situation hours ago. They turned a corner into a larger maintenance sector lined with inactive transport rails stretching into darkness. Massive support columns disappeared high into the shadows above, while old commuter platforms sat abandoned beneath layers of dust and debris. Ethan slowed immediately. Something felt wrong. Too quiet. He crouched beside the rail platform and brushed 2 fingers lightly across the floor. Fresh boot marks. Recently disturbed dust. "We are not alone," he muttered. Lysera's expression tightened slightly. Before either of them could react further, a sharp mechanical click echoed through the station. Then another. Ethan spun instantly, rifle raised toward the upper platform balconies. Figures emerged from the shadows all around the station. Armed soldiers in dark tactical armor. At least 12. Rebel insignias glowed faintly red across their chest plates beneath the station lights. Ethan stepped slightly in front of Lysera without thinking. One of the soldiers lowered his weapon enough to speak. "Human," he called out calmly, "stand down." Ethan remained perfectly still. Not happening. The soldier removed his helmet slowly. "Lieutenant Harper." Pale. Exhausted. "Human resistance officer." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You could have announced yourselves without the dramatic ambush." Harper glanced toward Lysera carefully before answering. "Trust is expensive underground." Ethan lowered the rifle a few inches, but did not fully relax. "You said resistance cells survived." "Some did." Harper looked around the ruined station. Most military divisions folded the moment the fleet switched sides. Civilians are hiding. Communications are collapsing. And by sunrise, Malrek intends to broadcast his authority to every world in the Empire. Lysera finally stepped forward beside Ethan. Even beneath the cloak, the station soldiers immediately straightened the moment they recognized her. Some lowered their eyes. Others looked almost ashamed. "How many sectors still resist him?" she asked quietly. Harper hesitated. That alone gave Ethan the answer before the lieutenant even spoke. "Not enough." Silence spread across the station. Above them, broken announcement speakers crackled faintly with static from long-dead transit systems. Water dripped steadily somewhere deep in the tunnels beyond the rails. Lysera absorbed the information without visible reaction, but Ethan noticed the subtle shift in her breathing again. Smaller now. Quieter. Like someone slowly realizing there might not be anything left to save. Harper stepped closer. "Your Majesty, the orbital relay tower is already under siege conditions. Malrek moved elite divisions there an hour ago." Ethan folded his arms. Of course he did. No unauthorized ships are permitted near orbit. Every fleet captain remaining loyal to the throne has either vanished or surrendered. Harper looked directly at Lysera now. "If you appear publicly before dawn, there is still a chance some outer systems reject his authority." Lysera stared silently down the dark rail tunnels stretching beneath the capital. "And if I fail?" Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Ethan spoke for them all. "Then at least they see the truth before he buries it." Harper studied Ethan carefully after that. "You are staying with her?" Ethan looked genuinely confused by the question. That has kind of been the pattern tonight. A few exhausted soldiers nearby exchanged faint looks at that. Not mockery. Something closer to disbelief. Harper slowly shook his head. "You understand what happens if Malrek captures the Queen alive." Ethan adjusted the rifle strap against his shoulder. "Then we should probably not let that happen." One of the rebel scanners suddenly beeped sharply near the upper platform. Immediate movement alerts flashed red across several tactical displays. Harper's face hardened instantly. They found the station. Far down the tunnel, distant engine noise began echoing through the underground rails. Low. Mechanical. Getting closer. Ethan exhaled once and raised the pulse rifle again. Beside him, Lysera looked toward the approaching darkness beneath the station lights. Then slowly, for the first time all night, the Queen reached out and lightly touched the back of Ethan's armored hand. Just once. Brief. Almost uncertain, but enough to make him glance toward her in surprise. Her glowing golden eyes met his quietly beneath the underground shadows. "You should not have stayed this long," she whispered softly. Ethan looked back toward the dark tunnel where enemy lights were beginning to appear through the smoke-filled rails. Then he tightened his grip on the rifle and stepped forward anyway. The underground rail station erupted into motion as warning alarms echoed through the tunnels. Rebel soldiers rushed into defensive positions behind overturned transport barriers, while sparks rained from damaged overhead cables. Far down the tracks, bright white searchlights cut through the smoke-filled darkness as armored transport carriers rolled closer beneath the city. Their engines vibrated through the station floor like approaching thunder. Ethan Cole stood near the center platform with his rifle raised, visor flickering weakly as target indicators struggled to stabilize through the interference. Beside him, Lieutenant Harper checked the charge cells on his sidearm with quick practiced movements. "They are sealing every transit exit," Harper warned. "If they trap us underground, the relay tower becomes unreachable." Ethan glanced toward Lysera, standing near the old station pillar beneath flickering blue lights. Even surrounded by exhausted resistance fighters and collapsing infrastructure, she still carried herself with impossible calm. But now Ethan understood the truth beneath it. She was not fearless. She was simply carrying the fear alone. Another tremor rolled through the station. Dust drifted from the ceiling in pale gray waves. The first enemy carrier finally emerged fully from the tunnel darkness ahead, black-armored, plating reflecting station lights. Across its surface, more followed behind it. Too many. Ethan checked the rifle charge counter again. 15% remaining. "Well," he muttered quietly, "that is officially not ideal." Harper looked toward the Queen. "Your Majesty, there is still one maintenance tunnel leading toward the orbital district. We can move you through while we hold this platform." Lysera immediately shook her head. "No." Harper stared at her in disbelief. "If you stay here, the line collapses. If I run while others remain behind, then Malrek was correct about me." Ethan looked over at her sharply. "Lysera, this is not the time to prove moral points." Her glowing golden eyes met his directly. "No. This is the only time they matter." Before Ethan could answer, blinding white floodlights suddenly activated across the station. Every shadow vanished beneath harsh illumination. Then a familiar voice echoed through the transit speakers overhead. "Regent Malrek. Calm. Controlled. Certain. Your Majesty," the voice announced across the station. "Please do not sacrifice more lives for a throne already lost." The resistance fighters around Ethan tightened nervously. Some lowered their weapons slightly. The psychological pressure hit harder than any artillery ever could. Malrek continued speaking. "The fleet has accepted my authority. The council has accepted my authority. Even your royal guard accepted reality before abandoning you." Ethan saw the words hit her this time. Small, invisible to most people. But he saw it. The exhaustion in her eyes deepened for half a second before disappearing again behind the mask of a ruler. "You are alone now," Malrek said softly through the station speakers. Ethan slowly stepped forward beside Lysera until they stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the harsh white station lights. "Funny," he muttered loud enough for nearby soldiers to hear, "because she does not look alone to me." A few resistance fighters glanced toward him in surprise. Then toward the Queen. Something shifted slightly across the station after that. Small, but real. One by one, soldiers raised their weapons again. Harper looked at Ethan for a long moment before quietly taking position. Beside him too. Then another soldier moved forward. Then another. Lysera stared at them in stunned silence. Not because they obeyed her, because they chose to stay. The station lights suddenly flickered violently as another transport carrier advanced down the rails. Sparks burst from the ceiling overhead. Ethan adjusted his stance and raised the pulse rifle toward the tunnel entrance. "Harper," he said quietly, "how long until the maintenance tunnel closes?" 3 minutes. Ethan nodded once. "Good enough." Lysera immediately looked toward him. "What are you doing?" Ethan gave a tired half-smile without looking away from the tunnel ahead. "Buying you 3 minutes." Her expression changed instantly. "No, yeah," Ethan answered calmly. "Pretty sure this is the part where the human does something reckless." More enemy lights appeared deeper in the tunnel behind the first carrier. Too many to stop. Ethan already knew that. Harper knew it too. Probably everyone in the station knew it. But somehow the human soldier still stepped forward toward the rails anyway. Lysera grabbed his armored forearm before he could move farther. Her hand trembled slightly against the black plating. "Ethan," she whispered softly, "you have already done enough." For one long second the noise of the station seemed to disappear around them. No alarms. No engines. No war. Just her hand holding on to him like she was afraid to let go of the last thing that still felt real. Ethan looked down at her glowing golden eyes beneath the harsh station lights. Then very gently, he placed his hand over hers. "You once asked me why I stayed," he said quietly. "It is because nobody should watch their world end alone." Lysera's breath caught slightly. Ethan slowly stepped away from her grasp and moved toward the front rail barricade with the rifle resting against his shoulder. Behind him, the Queen stood motionless beneath the flickering station lights while the human soldier walked toward an impossible line he already knew he could not survive forever. Sunrise over the capital of Ethar looked softer after the fires finally stopped burning. Pale gold light spilled across the towering silver skyline while repair drones drifted quietly between damaged buildings like slow-moving stars. The war had ended 3 days earlier. Regent Malrek's fleet fractured before the orbital broadcast could fully begin. Several outer systems rejected his authority the moment surviving resistance channels released footage from the underground stations. Not footage of speeches. Not propaganda. Just images of exhausted soldiers standing beside their queen while one battered human held the front line long enough for the truth to escape the city. Somehow, that changed everything. Ethan Cole still did not fully understand why. He sat now on the balcony of the temporary Royal Medical Wing overlooking the recovering capital with one arm secured inside a medical brace and a cup of terrible station coffee balanced carefully in his other hand. Morning wind rolled gently through the open balcony arches, carrying the distant sound of construction crews and transport traffic slowly returning to life across the city below. Ethan stared down at the coffee suspiciously before taking another sip anyway. "You continue drinking that despite clearly hating it," Lysera observed from behind him. Ethan glanced back over one shoulder. The Queen stepped onto the balcony dressed not in ceremonial royal robes this time, but in a simple dark blue uniform beneath a silver coat that moved softly in the morning breeze. Without the weight of the crown and court surrounding her, she somehow looked younger now. Lighter. Still regal. But real in a way the galaxy had probably never seen before. Ethan lifted the cup slightly. "Human military tradition. We survive through stubbornness and bad coffee." Lysera walked beside him until they stood together overlooking the city skyline. "Your species has very strange survival methods. You are just jealous because your empire lost a war to caffeine and poor decision-making." That earned him the small laugh he had started hearing more often these past few days. Quiet at first. Easier now. For a moment neither of them spoke. Morning sunlight reflected softly across the Queen's silver hair, while repair ships crossed the sky above the recovering capital. Far below, civilians filled the streets again for the first time since the coup collapsed. Life returning. Ethan rested his arms against the balcony railing carefully. "So," he said after a moment, "what happens now?" Lysera looked out over her city in silence before answering. "Now I spend the next several years rebuilding trust one should have protected better." Ethan nodded slowly. "That sounds exhausting." "It will be." Then she looked sideways toward him, golden eyes calmer now than he had ever seen them. "Which is why I intended to ask you something before the council meeting this morning." Ethan immediately frowned. "That sentence feels dangerous." Another small smile touched her lips. "The council wishes to formally offer you command status within the restored Imperial Guard." Ethan nearly choked on the coffee. "Absolutely not." Lysera blinked once in surprise. "You refused before I even finished speaking. I spent one night helping royalty and almost got crushed by a palace, hunted through underground tunnels, and emotionally manipulated by an entire collapsing empire." He pointed at his medical brace. "I am counting this as a learning experience." To Ethan's surprise, Lysera laughed openly this time. Warm. Genuine. The sound carried softly into the morning air above the city. "Then perhaps," she said carefully once the laughter faded, "I should ask something smaller." Ethan narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "That depends entirely on your definition of smaller." The Queen turned fully toward him now. No throne. No audience. Just the woman who once stood alone beneath emergency lights while her world collapsed around her. "Stay," she said softly. Ethan stared at her for a long moment while morning sunlight reflected across the skyline behind them. "As what?" he finally asked quietly. Lysera's expression softened in a way that would have shocked the entire empire only days earlier. "Honestly," she admitted, "I was hoping we could figure that out together." Ethan looked down into the coffee cup in his hands, then back toward the queen standing beside